In this tutorial, I will show you how to monitor Docker containers with Nagios using standard Nagios plugins with the help of HowRU. Before looking at how to use Nagios with HowRU, just let us get into HowRU, which is a standalone one-node monitoring system that uses Nagios plugins and then exposes the results with an API. I've just started up a Docker container that has HowRU installed, and I'll launch a bash shell in which I just make a tail of the HowRU log file. As you can see, it runs some check commands here. Which commands that HowRU will run is defined in a file called etc howru plugins.conf. The plugins.conf file is a semicolon separated file where you define a name and description, and then the actual check command with all its arguments that should be run by HowRU, and the final one and one here is whether it's active or not, and its interval. You can see a check uptime here is an interval of 60. That is, it will run just once an hour. You might also notice that the checks here don't have a full path. Where HowRU should look after actual check scripts is defined in another configuration file called etc howruc.conf. Here you can see that it uses userlib Nagios plugins, where a standard Ubuntu Nagios plugin file has installed some standard Nagios checks. We go back and look in the var log HowRUC log, and we see that HowRU is still running some checks here. HowRU wants to collect a full set of data that it needs to run every check command at least once before it can expose the results in the API. When HowRU has a complete set of monitoring information, it will dump it also to a file on disk, a data file, which will then later be used by the API to expose the monitoring data to the outside world. So I exit the Docker shell, and I'm back in my terminal on my laptop doing Docker PS, and I can see that the HowRU container is up and running, and that it has port forwarding port 80 to port 80 on my local host. I simply curl the local host on port 80 to get some answers from the API. HowRU monitoring HowRU is giving a compilation of the check results. You can see it has returned code 0. We can also query the API for criticals, and we get an empty JSON set because there were no criticals here. If I instead query the API for JSON, I get the full JSON blob of all the check commands that has been run in the HowRU Docker container. And I can also look for a specific plugin check by using plugin with argument ID. When HowRU reads the plugins conf, each plugin get an ID. Or I can also, if I know the plugin name, use that to query the HowRU API after a specific plugin output. In this case, then control load. The Docker container with HowRU exposes port 80 to my local host. I can also go HTTP localhost and get a small web page where you get links to the different APIs that HowRU exposes. So this is a really short introduction to the HowRU single node monitoring system, and now we will try to look at how to actually use HowRU to monitor Docker containers and get the data to Nagios. So first I will start another container called HowRU Scheduler. The fact is that HowRU is actually consisting of two different services, the scheduler and the API. And in this container, I only run the scheduler. Once again, I go in with a bash shell into the container, and we look at the HowRU log file. And we have some checks running at this moment in this container. Exit that log and we go to the HowRU conf file, etc howruc.conf, and we can see that this container has a data JSON file named monitor data JSON, and it should store that in opt HowRU www. If this data dir is a shared one, it will be easily picked up by an API running on a different server. We also see it has some plugins running, standard Linux checks, I would say. I exit this container right now. And if we do a docker ps, we can see the container is running, but it has no ports exposed to my local host here. I will start another Docker container called HowRU Scheduler app. And running docker ps, you can see we have two containers, and the second one is actually exposed in port 8082 to my local host. And if I go to my web browser and localhost port 8082, I get a very important page. The second container called app is actually running Apache as well as the HowRU scheduler. So it's an important page that we want to monitor. Let's get into a bash shell in HowRU scheduler app, the container. And if we tail the HowRUC log, we see it's running some checks. So HowRU scheduler is running here. We can also look at the plugins here, and we can see it's a few different. We check Apache processes and Apache server. We have some standard Nagios checks for HTTP server on this container. And if we look into the HowRUC conf, we can also see it has a different name on its JSON file. We call this one app01 data JSON, but it has the same data dir. And if we have this data dir as a shared one between containers, we can run later on an API in a different container or on a real steel server hosting the containers. We look at the log again, and we can see it's collecting data to the file. We're ready to go. So right now we have two Docker containers with HowRU scheduler running in them, but we have no IPI. So let's start another container, a third one, with the IPI running on it. And running docker ps, we can see that the HowRU IPI container is exposing or port forwarding port 80 to our local host. So we could know once again curl localhost port 80, HowRU, monitoring, and HowRU, for instance, one of the IPIs. And we get answers from both those Docker containers that are running HowRU scheduler, the HowRUtestdomain.com and app01. That was the very important server, remember, app01. And if I only want to know how app01 is doing, I can do that with a server argument to the HowRU, and I get only the answer from that particular server too. So the IPI now is providing information from both those Docker containers. So let us imagine that the HowRU schedulers are containers running on a server where you have the HowRU IPI running. The server hosting the containers would be a real steel server with an IP address suitable to run Nagios checks from an ordinary Nagios server. But we would need a plugin. And of course, I have one right here. So this plugin, check HowRU, is written in Python. Takes some parameters, of course, and it could be run from any Nagios compatible server. The most important arguments that it takes is host, and we run the IPI on the local host, and the port, which is port 80, and which IPI you want to query. And running this check against our local HowRU IPI give us the answer, okay, all two servers are fine. We might know if we have any criticals. It will return that there's no alerts on any of them. We can also check any of the APIs on the HowRU, like OKs or whatever we're interested in. But let's say we want to know HowRU on just one of those servers, Apple1, the one with a very important web page. We add the argument E to check HowRU, and I get only the answer from that particular. We might also, of course, be interested in a particular check, and we can use API plugin with the check HowRU Nagios plugin, either providing the ID, which is actually the order in which a check has been loaded into the HowRU scheduler. ID1 is ping, but we can also do it by name, argument N. We tried check load before, so check plus load, and we get check load from app01 testdomain.com. So with this Nagios plugin, you can check everything from compilation of all checks on all Docker containers running on a server with a HowRU API, or just the result of a particular check in a particular container, and get that right into your Nagios monitoring system. One thing to be aware of, though, is that Nagios and HowRU does have different schedulers. HowRU API always answer with the result of a single check's last run. The check HowRU plugin can measure the time difference between the call from the Nagios server and when the check was actually run by the HowRU scheduler. This latency could be expected to be up to 59 seconds, even if both the Nagios server scheduler and the HowRU scheduler has a 1-minute interval configuration on a particular check. By passing the argument L to check HowRU plugin, you can see if you have unexpected latency, in which case you should change check interval either on Nagios or on HowRU. The L parameter counts difference in seconds, and the results above are expected since CPU stats have a 2-minute interval and check uptime have a 60-minute interval. Let us also look briefly at the check HowRU multi-API Nagios plugin. This Nagios plugin scans multiple HowRU APIs after a given Docker container. When deploying containers in real life, you might not always know on which server it will actually be running, but with the multi-API plugin, you can scan multiple HowRU APIs. So we run the check HowRU multi-API with host localhost, port 80, and we add another fictive server, myserverdomain.com, and a completely different port. And we want to look for the HowRU API, how are you? And on this server named app01 testdomain.com. And we will get an answer. The answer is, of course, from localhost, but it could be on any server in the list you're providing in the H parameter. And finally, I will just show a last Nagios plugin called Check HowRU Plugins, which can be used not in Docker containers, but if you're running HowRU on a VMware server or a real steel server and want to use HowRU and connect to Nagios using, for instance, NRPE. Maybe you experienced NRP timeouts with a check, and you can have HowRU running that check instead, and then get the result back to Nagios with the check HowRU plugin. If you've been with me this far and think it's interesting, you go to GitHub, Andlind HowRU, and you get the source code if you want to build with, for instance, Red Hat or Debian. You also have packages ready for Debian, an alerter, and at the end the HowRU monitor latest version, the same in Red Hat, latest version is 0.28. It might be a higher version when you actually look here, but I will upload new versions to this page. You also find the plugins, which I showed you in this tutorial. And the GitHub address and also my email address are at the beginning of this presentation. Thank you for watching. And don't hesitate to contact me if you need further information. Thank you.